Hello, welcome to Watchet Baptist Church online. My name's Mike, I'm the pastor at Watchet Baptist Church. You're joining us for part 6 in our series looking at the story of 1 Samuel in the Old Testament of the Bible. We're going to be looking at the first 11 verses of chapter 4. So after a brief pause to allow some dog walkers to come by, we're going to begin that reading. Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Aphek. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim, and Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. When the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" When they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said. "Oh no, nothing like this has happened before. We're doomed. He will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods. They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been subject to you. Be men and fight." So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. The ark of God was captured, and Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So I want to break today's session down into 4 headings. And the first one is this: look, no Samuel. This is the story that is called 1 Samuel. The book is called that. And largely speaking, it is a story through which we see Samuel's life. By the time we get to 2 Samuel, Samuel isn't around anymore. And so in some ways, it's just a way of titling a history. But actually, at this stage, this book has been mostly concerned with Samuel and the people around him. And for this section, he's not present. And that might just be really significant. We're able to see through the history of God's people, of Israel, up to this point, that God leads through people who he raises up. You go all the way back to Abraham in Genesis 12. You start seeing this pattern that God raises people up who are going to lead God's people in the way that God would choose. And he establishes agreements with them and with their people. By the time we get to Samuel, we've been through the period that's recorded in the book of Judges. Various different leaders have been raised up. Not all of them particularly great, but they've been there. At this point, chapter 4, God's leadership is absent. There is no leader in this story that God has raised up. In fact, the only individuals that get named are Hophni and Phinehas, who are already established as people who are not good news. They are corrupt. They are a bad influence. They are doing things in God's name that aren't God's choices. So there is an absence of God's leadership here. This, for me, is an important thing to notice, because there is a tendency, or there has been certainly in my experience, to read the things that happen with and to do with and for and around Israel, and to assume that things that the Israelites do are generally a good idea. As sometimes the stories are told to show us what a bad idea is, and it's not always made abundantly clear that that's the case. You have to read what's happening and know a bit about what God is like, and then apply that understanding in order to really get at what's going on. So here we need to notice there is a lack of God's chosen leadership. There is the presence of those who are established as not following God. And then there are also patterns that we see in what is said and done that show us something not very clever. And that takes me to my second heading, the superstitious people of God. At this stage, we can see, if we look carefully, that what really is happening here isn't a faithful involvement of God in what the people of Israel are doing. Instead, they're being superstitious. The concept goes something like this: if you bring along the symbol of God, then he will back you. Verse 3 says pretty much that. Let's just go back and check it. When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat on us today? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." Think about that for a moment. What they're saying is, if we bring the ark, God comes, and therefore he won't let us lose, because he'll be there, and he of course wouldn't let us lose. Why would he? But the assumption behind it is that the elders can control where God is and what he's going to do by moving stuff around. Effectively, the Ark of the Covenant, this is the thing that carries the law, that's become an idol. We put that idol where we want it to go, and therefore our God will back us. He will come through for us. He will make sure that our plans succeed. It's become not a symbol of God's presence, but effectively a good luck charm. Like wearing a charm necklace or bracelet because you think that will bring you good luck or will make you successful or effective. That's effectively what's happening here. This is what the people of Israel have reduced God to. And also in verse 4, they don't consult God, they just drag him in. There's no conversation, there's no dialogue. Now, in the previous chapter, there are two key things that were said that we need to remember at this point are, one, there weren't a lot of visions. People didn't hear from God very much. And that tells us something about the context. People aren't familiar with God's voice and how it works. And so that's the second thing. People aren't used to having dialogue with God. They're prepared to go along and do what they think is the right thing to do or whatever they feel best about, without finding out whether it's something that's God's idea. Now that also has, not in 1 Samuel, but it also has a biblical backdrop. And that's at the end of Judges. Pretty much the last word in Judges is, at that time, people just did whatever they thought was a good idea. And the writer of Samuel wants you to notice that God has begun to speak in a way that's recognizable. Eli may have taken a while to notice, but he noticed. And Samuel has now understood what it is to hear God's voice. And in this situation, in chapter 4, verses 1 to 11, there is no consulting with God. There's no talking to him. There's no dialogue. There's no, I wonder whether God is in this or not. And that takes me on to heading number 3, which is messed up theology versus desperation. So in verse 9 and verse 8, we see attitudes of the two different armies involved in this episode. The Philistines are frightened of God's reputation. Verse 8. They don't just say, "Oh, we've heard about this God." They name things that this God has done, particularly when it comes to Egypt. "We're doomed," they say. "He will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods. They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness." And they may have got their understanding a bit muddled up because the plagues didn't happen in the wilderness. But you can see that they've got a grasp of how mighty this God is. And so they're worried. The Israelites' response, however, to the ark arriving into camp is such a roar that it makes the ground shake. Big noise. And so they feel very confident. Possibly too confident. So a complacency starts to come in for Israelites because they believe that their God is going to back them because they've dragged him along. The Philistines, by contrast, get desperate. "This is awful," they say. "We're going to have to really step up. Big men, come on, fight harder." And so by the time we get to verse 10, we see this put really plainly. The Philistines fought. It doesn't say the Israelites did. Now that may well, of course, be an exaggeration, We've got to be careful as well that we don't take silence as an indication of something, but we might notice that this writer, Israelite writer, says the Philistines were up for this. And the implication is that maybe the Israelites weren't because of that complacency. And that brings us on to heading number 4. God won't act as the kind of God he isn't. I'm not sure that's good grammar, but the point I wanted to pick up was God doesn't just do things because we think it'd be bad for his reputation if he didn't, or vice versa. He's not a God who is going to be bound by anything other than who he is, the kind of God he is. I remember learning at Bible college that God does have limits. I was stunned, to say the least. The question the lecturer asked was, does God have limits? And I put my hand up and said, no. And the answer actually is yes, he is limited by his character. There are things he can't do because he's not that kind of person, or not that kind of God. He can't do evil. It's beyond him to do that. God isn't going to behave like the kind of God that he isn't. So in this instance, he's not going to play along with what Israel is doing just because he's their God and they've had an idea that they think is a good one. He's only going to be himself. And that means that there are moments when God doesn't come through for Israel, simply because the thing they want him to do isn't something that he is going to choose to do. In other words, God is willing to risk his reputation rather than not be who he truly is. And that perhaps reminds us the importance of character in God's experience, in God's eyes, from God's perspective. It's only a few chapters on from this that we get that very well-known line, man looks at the outside, but God looks at the heart. And that's how Samuel is meeting David for the very first time. This is a God who is not bound to do what the Israelites would like him to do, but is only going to be who he is. And it's so important for us as people of God, as those people of Jesus who follow his lead and are obedient to him, to remember that actually if we step out as a church and do something that isn't within his philosophy, doesn't follow his pattern or his priorities, he doesn't necessarily help us to make it work just because we think it's a good idea. That's perhaps something that's going to take some getting our head around. There are definitely moments that I have experienced in church where people say, well, if we're doing something in God's name, then he will bring success to that. I would say that Israel's experience against the Philistines in 1 Samuel 4 says that God doesn't necessarily follow through with our plans just because we've invoked him. He will still do what he thinks is right. Indeed, in the verses immediately at the end of chapter 3, Eli reminds us of the importance of that when he is faced with the information that God has passed to Samuel and has to cope with the idea that God is going to bring judgment to Eli and his family. And he says, let God do what God believes is right to do. In some ways, this story brilliantly contrasts Eli's words at the end of chapter 3 with those at the end of Judges. People were just doing what they thought was a good idea to do, and Eli says God's going to do what is right in his eyes. And here's an example of that in practice. So what do we take away from this? Well, I think really just one thing, and I've touched on it a moment ago. The thing to take away is that before we set out and do anything in God's name, let's consult him first and be willing to not do it if he doesn't want it done. I have had moments as a disciple and as a minister too of thinking, oh, I think I should do this. I think this would be a really good thing to do. And then having to allow God to knock gently on the door of my heart and say, no, that's not something I've asked for. Don't do that. And it can be a bit heartbreaking, particularly when you're quite invested in something or it's your own idea and you think it's a good one. To have God say, yeah, let's leave that one, can be really difficult to do. It takes a lot of confidence in God and a fair chunk of humility too. But the alternative is the absolute disaster that the Israelites experienced, where from the original battle they lost 4,000, and when they kept going with this plan that God wasn't in, they lost a further 30,000 foot soldiers. 30,000 men of the nation were lost because of a superstitious attitude to who God is. Let's guard our own hearts against that kind of attitude. Let's pray. Lord, help us to put ourselves in front of you with all the things that we think are a good idea, to allow a dialogue with you to shape how we serve you, to never assume that we know what you would do, but always to ask, to have such an open dialogue with you and to involve others in it, that we learn your voice and know what you're saying. Give us courage in all those things, and determination and patience when we need it to. And would we be successful in following your lead? Amen. Okay, so as ever, we're doing 3 questions. Question 1 is this: what are the superstitions that we find among Christians? It'd be great at this point if you don't say, well, I don't really know any Christians who are superstitious. Let's go back and look at the story here. There's a pattern that we might see replicated in our own experience of the God's people saying, well, that didn't work out, so how do we just drag God into this and then assume it'll work? Or what do we... Is there a form of words that we use in prayer maybe that we just think, well, if I use the right words, then definitely that will mean that God's going to be on my side? Have a little think. Reflect on what you've experienced, people that you've met, but also on your own life lived alongside Jesus. How do superstitions creep in with Christians? Okay, question 2. How can we avoid assuming that God will back our plan? How can we avoid assuming that God will back our plan? What can we build in to protect ourselves against that? And question 3, what can the church do to help disciples avoid complacency? What can the church do? What can this church do, the church that we're part of, to guard against complacency as we walk with God? Well, that's it for this time. Thank you for being with us. I look forward to catching up with you all soon, and do take care. God bless.